All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And indeed, welcome to the EUniWell Open Lecture Series. My name is Silvio Piros. I am the Arena Manager for Research Arena 2, Individual Social Wellbeing, and Senior Ground Manager at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs of Leiden University in the Netherlands. It is my pleasure to moderate today's very timely and I'm sure extremely engaging session on war, peace, and overcoming helplessness, the role of universities, and introduce our lecturer. Before I do so, a couple of words about the format of today's lecture. Of course, the session will last for 1 hour in total and will be divided between the lecture itself, around 45 minutes, and the discussion and Q&A. Now, to join the conversation, you're kindly asked to use the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar platform. So you can send in your questions or comments during the lecture, and I will post them during the Q&A. Now, I have the great honor and pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Professor Koops, who is the Chair of Security Studies and Scientific Director of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University's campus in The Hague. His research focuses on global security governance and the European Union's foreign and security policies, the role of the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, and their inter-organizational relations in peace and security, as well as crisis management, peacekeeping, the responsibility to protect, and the changing nature of diplomacy. In addition to this, Professor Koops is interested in issues of academic diplomacy, as well as higher education, innovation, and reform. And with this, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. And Professor Koops, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Silvio, and thanks for Semmelweis University for hosting this webinar, and of course for the EUniWell Association, and to all of you who tuned in despite a very, very busy Thursday, I'm pretty sure. I owe also, I think, all participants an apology, because initially the focus of this lecture that I agreed to give some months ago was to focus really on the research arena on education and research on well-being that I'm leading for EUniWell, Arena 2, and the topic was individual, social, and societal well-being, the role of universities in promoting this. But I did feel, a fortnight ago, that talking now about well-being, or individual well-being in universities, in the context now of a major war in Europe, would maybe be the wrong signal, and also maybe not the right topic. I will give a quick one slide background on what is going on in EUniWell and what is going on in this research arena on individual, societal, and social well-being. But I do want to focus on the title of War, Peace, and Overcoming Helplessness. And also, I don't really want this to be an entire 45 minutes lecture, but really also a platform and opportunity at the end of the couple of remarks I'm going to make for sharing ongoing initiatives, thoughts, and ideas that you might have. I think this is also an important function now of university communities to act as multipliers for precisely actions that either have been already done by enormous resourceful students, student communities, or staff members in the small or in the bigger scale of things. I'm already sure that you have lots of experience that you can share here as well, apart from the ones I will draw on. Let me very briefly get the slides up and running, and of course feel free to come in with comments and questions as you see fit. I think Sylvia will take on the moderation of that. So what I would like to do in the next 35 minutes or so to also leave enough time really for your ideas and for you coming in. Quick context and caveats, I have to say a little bit about my own perspective. I really feel as a peace and security scholar, it's quite important when we talk particularly about conflicts now and the war in Ukraine, to explain a little bit what each speaker's perspective and background is and what it's not. It's, I think, helpful to really provide a bit of context and caveats here for the remarks that I'm going to make. Then a quick one slide kind of wrap up, focus on the original topic that I was initially intending to talk about. And then, of course, I wanted to give you a bit of a historical background on the role of universities in times of war and conflict. So that draws a little bit also on my research on academic diplomacy and the role of universities across time, and a topic that also Silvio Piros is focusing on indeed. The continued importance of academic diplomacy in universities as actors in their own rights. I think we underestimate very often what we can do as resourceful communities, even though we should also not overestimate what we can do, particularly when faced with large-scale conflict and where, you know, politics, of course, and to some extent also defense establishments have a lead role. But also I think the voices for diplomacy and peace should not be drowned out. This is also something I'm going to briefly focus on. I think that we have a responsibility as scholars of security studies and global affairs as well to ensure that the public discourse and the choices that policymakers are indeed advocating do not really forget also peaceful approaches without appeasement, if that is indeed possible. Some examples of what has already been done. Here I'm focusing particularly on the war in Ukraine, and what can be done and should be done even further. I'm sure I'm just going to give some examples. I'm sure there are many, many more. And again, I'm very interested in your experiences and ideas here. So the context and the caveats, very, very briefly. So Silvio mentioned already my background. So I'm working at the intersection of, really global security governance. A lot on that focuses on UN peacekeeping and peace building, but I also work on European security. And in particular, during the last 2 years, I'm leading a group of international scholars and evaluators to evaluate the OSCE special monitoring mission in Ukraine, which has been there since 2014. And as you might know, has of course now disbanded or has temporarily halted, well, let's hope it's only temporarily, its presence and missions there because of casualties of its own mission and the impossible situation right now in Ukraine. I do this for the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network. So I work on the conflict, so to say, but I'm not an area specialist. And I really want to stress that because I think when listening to experts right now on the conflict, it is quite important that we give the word really and the voice to those that have been studying for decades the area itself, know the language and know the conflicts ins and outs. So I am not one of those experts. I'm coming from a organizational perspective that looks at what the international community and organizations do. I will draw on some more research on academic diplomacy, which kind of complements a little bit my interest in security studies, but also European dimensions of teaching excellence. And I will also draw a little bit on what we can do as academic managers. So I've occupied academic management positions for the last 10 years, first at the University of Brussels, also in a think tank called the Global Governance Institute, but now full-time and most importantly as academic director of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University, even though my remarks are not on behalf of the institute, that's for sure. And in the context of EUniWell, which is of course very important for this context of this lecture, I have the privilege of coordinating the Research and Education Arena 2, as it's called, and this focuses on individual, social, and societal well-being, linked in particular to human rights, security, peace, and sustainable development. Goal 16, for those of you that know the SDGs, you will of course know that this is focusing on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And what we do there as a team of representatives of all the EUniWell universities and the network of students and researchers is to think about well-being beyond, it's not excluding it, but also beyond health. Very often, of course, researchers on well-being comes out of social psychology, health, medical sciences, but also linking that to security, human rights, and justice questions. So not only the individual well-being, but also what is the well-being of society, so to say. What is the well-being, what determines the well-being or determines the end of well-being for communities, and so on and so forth. And I think it's important to stress here as well that, for example, in the UN Charter itself, the term well-being also is mentioned twice when it comes to the well-being of states and also the well-being of populations. And that's a mix of economic well-being, but also, of course, stability and enjoying access to strong institutions that are really governed by justice, security, and human rights. It also includes focusing on combating all forms of violence, corruption, discrimination, and strengthening justice. So this is indeed one of the focus areas of the EUniWell European University Alliance. And we also look there, of course, at our own roles. So in many ways, there are key actors in the lead on these issues. These are international organizations, these are ministries, these are civil society organizations, but also universities themselves are actors. And again, I will say a lot about the limitations of universities, but we should also, in the context of maybe overcoming helplessness, so to say, be aware of the strengths and the resourcefulness that university communities have, certainly on their own, but also even stronger in networks that can span continents and are ever so important right now when we consider the dire situation of war in Ukraine. And I will also focus a little bit on the importance to maintain networks, not only for Ukrainian scholars, students, and citizens, but also to maintain links to Russian civil society and those Russian citizens that are speaking out against the war, but are also very much affected now and oppressed. There is a duty also to maintain strong links here, and academic diplomacy can help. The Arena 2 also looks at the internal role of universities. Of course, well-being in the medical sense is a key issue, not only since COVID, but even before. I'm in particular always very much concerned about our younger colleagues, PhD candidates in particular. The rate of mental illnesses, for example, and burnouts amongst PhDs is rising, has been steadily on the rise. And this is something that is indicative also about our own environment and what universities themselves maybe do through their work structuring to the detriment of individual well-being. So there's something also I think that needs to be mentioned here, because it would be hypocritical to talk about the positive impact of universities on well-being internally and externally without acknowledging that, of course, we also have a variety of issues as universities in the academic community that we need to deal with even in peace times, and less dramatic areas and topics like war and peace. And then it looks also at international networks, partnerships, and so on and so forth. It might be interesting for those of you interested in networks of universities in promoting well-being that since the last 30 years, there have been an incredible emergence of international networks that focus on health to be promoted through universities. So in the US, there are dedicated networks of universities for health. In Europe, there are a variety of networks that both include strong presence of German universities, British universities that focus on the promotion of well-being. In the Netherlands, there's a network of caring universities. So it's also interesting to see that the topic of well-being has strong network footings in recent years. So in the Q&A, if you're interested about that work and the work we're doing here, I'm also very happy to, of course, talk more about that. But moving to the topic of today, and also helplessness, it's maybe a quick term I also need to elaborate a little bit on. Of course, on the one, I mean, everyone knows what helplessness is. I think we all felt it, we all feel it, not only now in the conflict that we see in Europe, but all of us, in fact, during the last years, if we think about the emergence of global challenges, if we think about the sheer avalanche of problems that seem to come together in recent years, that indeed threaten humanity, be it pandemics, be it the climate change challenge that has not gone away, on the contrary, and of course now conflict. So it's of course an own personal sense of paralysis, and I have to admit I had exactly the same feeling on the 22nd of February and 24th when the war broke out, and I'm pretty sure amongst many colleagues, it helped to discuss this a little bit, but also the question always that popped up in the head is, okay, what can we do? What can we do? Not only for the many friends that I have both in the Ukraine and in Russia, but also for simply on the civilian side, and how can we use our voice and our activities is, of course, always the first question when you try to overcome paralysis. But it's also important to note that helplessness was also chosen as one of the key themes, or overcoming helplessness, or let's say unlearning helplessness, as the Munich Security Conference report called it. It was a key leading theme in this year's Munich Security Conference discussions. Those of you who are not familiar with security studies, I mean, the Munich Security Conference really is the prime forum right now, or has been for the last decade, on security issues. All world leaders really come there in February to Munich normally to discuss key issues. There's a lot of backroom, informal negotiations as well, diplomatic networks, mediation. It has really become the Davos of security issues. Notably, this year, the Russian delegation, which always has attended this in previous years, has decided not to come. There was a very emotional speech by Ukrainian President Zelensky. But what hasn't maybe received so much attention is that the Munich Security Conference commissioned a report in a global survey where the theme of helplessness was really one of the key sentiments and feelings that emerged. It was a global survey for that was conducted for a period of 7 months. And just some statistics here, you see that, for example, 64% of respondents in Brazil and 63% in South Africa expressed concern about a growing number of crises and the inability to cope with them. So not only the inability, obviously, of you and me as an individual, but also of those institutions entrusted with tackling these challenges. It's a little bit lower, but not that much in Europe. 61% of people in Italy, 59 in France, 51 in Canada, showed that people, but also institutions, will simply not be able to deal and get a grip with these global challenges. And Ischinger himself, the chairman of the MSC, who had his last conference and stepped down after that conference, opened the security conference by remarking that, we need to do something about it and not let the feeling of helplessness overwhelm us. Otherwise, it's becoming kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which leads us all to kind of resign, give up, even though we do have the tools and resources to address the variety of challenges, including great power confrontation. So the focus is not so much on dwelling on that we are helplessness or should feel helplessness, even though there's empathy required for us as academics as well, especially when we deal with students. Many of you who are teaching right now might also, of course, have an increased sense of anxiety among students and the constant question of what can be done, but also to point out the tools and focus really on what resources we have available and can really mobilize to overcome this sense of helplessness. And that requires to focus on impacts that can be small and large. And in particular now, for the purposes of this lecture, what can we do as part of university communities? Very briefly, I don't want to dwell too much on history here, but I think it's important to point out there is also an academic and research dimension to this. And it's always useful to look into history, antecedents, and to really understand that universities very often played a very, very strong role in its local environment or even internationally when it came to situations of war and conflict. The tradition of academic diplomacy, using scholars or attracting scholars, really goes all the way down to the very beginnings or even precursors to the modern university as we know it. So by modern university, I mean to refer to those universities that emerged after the 14th century. But even you have ancient precursors, and here the earliest precursor I can think of, which both Sylvia and I wrote about, is of course the Museon, so the research institute attached to which the Library of Alexandria was attached, established. It's not entirely clear when it was precisely established, but sometime 300 BC in the Ptolemaic, under the Ptolemaic rulers, was used, of course, to attract the most knowledgeable scholars, researchers for, and I should stress this here, not particularly altruistic reasons, but of course also to enhance and enlarge the progress, but also even power base of rulers. I stress this here because I think when we talk later on about what can we as universities do, and that also includes, for example, scholars at risk networks, scholarships, and so on, we should really try to focus here on altruistic reasons. So not to build up our own capacity, so to say, but really design a program from the beginning that also looks ahead to the future of the country and conflict situation from where the scholars are fleeing, in order not to contribute to a brain drain after the conflict, but also to build up capacities for local rebuilding of structures, infrastructure, but also university structures when the conflict has been resolved. There are very clear examples of the beginnings of the role of universities and scholars in attracting them, maintaining them, and to use them, of course, also for building a variety of political ends. Also, remember the early days of the University of Cambridge, which was indeed a creation of Oxford University, scholars and students fleeing from violence and lynching in Oxford at that time. So sometimes conflict and escape from conflict can also lead to the buildup of a university in exile or a university completely on its own. There are important roles of universities, scholars and students in creating networks of cooperation understanding. And this is a research field in its own, which is under the umbrella of science diplomacy or academic diplomacy, as it's sometimes called. So the active role of scholars, this can be social scientists, but it can also be, of course, natural scientists, to maintain strong links and to really conduct a kind of tier 3 diplomacy. Even there, one has to be careful. There's a lot of studies that also, of course, caution that scholars should maintain academic freedom and should not be enlisted for the, let's say, use of governments or regimes. So we need to resist instrumentalization. We should not become quasi-diplomats for the aims of governments, but we should also be aware that scholars with strong networks and standing can play an important role in promoting cooperation and understanding, even in times of acute crisis between warring factions. During the Cold War, for example, governments had to rely a lot on scientific networks and cooperations between opposing camps, which helped what often was the only channel of cooperation and exchange of information. And really the 18th century was the beginning of these kind of networks. And you can also see studies on the eve of the First World War, where even when countries were at war in Europe, the strong networks between scholars, the personal links, also helped to maintain a sense of cooperation between universities that also helped after the end of the First World War in building quickly again peaceful relations, but also just important exchange of knowledge. Of course, universities can play a positive as well as a negative role. 1940s, and particularly the Second World War, but also the terrible period of the Nazi regime showed both the negative role that universities played, so-called Gleichschaltung, subduing all universities under the ideological and abhorrent ideology of the Nazi regime, but at the same time also ingenious and brave and innovative approaches by universities to help those scholars fleeing from the terrors of the Nazi regime. So the New School in New York, itself a university that was set up after the First World War, or at the time of the First World War, splitting from Columbia University because scholars resisted the US government's requirement of all scholars to support the war efforts. So they saw themselves in the academic freedom infringed, set up a new school in New York, and they themselves, in response to scholars being persecuted and having to flee from the Nazi regime, created a university in exile in 1933, hosting almost 200 faculty members. And I will come back to that in a second. And I think that is an important example to think of and keep in mind when thinking about what universities can do. In more modern times, the European Humanities University, which was initially founded in Minsk in 1992, when Belarus was a little bit more open, or far more open than now, or even 10 years ago, had to relocate because of Lukashenko's increasingly repressive regime, and the government of Lithuania dedicated funds towards this to establish essentially a European Humanities University in exile branch in Vilnius in 2004. And since then, it was not only used by Belarusian students, but also by students from all over Europe, and with significant funding both from the US, but also the European Union. It's still operating today. It's facing a lot of challenges, but it is also an interesting case study to look into what universities can do in terms of establishing universities outside, and what governments can do to support this. Scholars at Risk Network, that might be something you have heard about before, originally established at the University of Cairo in Egypt, and it really grew during the last 20 years into a global network and local chapters, UK, Denmark, France, for universities offering essentially sanctuary to scholars at grave risk. And grave risk means risk to their lives, risk to their livelihoods. And this is a great initiative where scholars from a variety of conflict zones will be offered short-term or long-term fellowships, often lasting years, in order to get them out of conflict zones and also give them a continued livelihood. In Ukraine itself, you have essentially national exile universities, which means not an exile outside the country, but within the country. Of course, after 2014, Crimean annexation, but also the attacks on the eastern parts, Luhansk and Donetsk, universities had to move to a different part of Ukraine. And Luhansk National University, one of the really leading technical universities, suffered after the invasion. Of course, a huge loss of students, half of the student body, 20% of the staff just in the first few months, and then decided to continue its operation as a network organization and using online tools. And I think it should also not be forgotten, 6 months ago, we had an entirely different focus in terms of the scholars at risks. That was Afghanistan, the sudden withdrawal of all foreign troops, and of course the humanitarian catastrophe, and also the deliberate attacks against civil society there. Strong focus on scholars, students, civil society members that fled from Afghanistan and were under the umbrella of Scholars at Risk supported. So apart from these examples, which show already the historical dimension of what universities either alone or in networks have done, and what is still being around right now, and I'll also come back to the new universities, University in Exile example, because they enlarged it since 2018 actually into a network of universities in exile. So universities themselves can become members and support this. We should, of course, I should once again say I'm always caught a little bit between, on the one hand, activism and confidence that we might be able to do more than we think, but on the other hand, also a sense of humility and proportion, of course, in situations such as now in terms of conflict. So we need to be having a balance between those things when we think about what we can do and what we cannot do. But as university communities, we've got an enormous amount of resources. And I don't only mean here financial resources, I mean resources in terms of committed students, incredibly value-guided students, knowledgeable scholars, and of course the possibility, the infrastructure for giving sanctuaries, and as the example just showed, which has been done throughout history before. There's nothing new really. But what is, I think, new is the amount of international networks of universities, but also between scholars, either through scientific collaboration or otherwise in the context of academic diplomacy and science diplomacy, which either formally in science diplomacy networks is being pursued, or you can call it like that, even though the people themselves will not call it like this, simply networks of scientists staying in touch. And you see this also in everyday discussions today at my own institute and the faculty, the amount of networks and personal contacts our colleagues and students have in Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere, also with the same situation in Afghanistan. So this is really a good starting point for thinking, okay, how can this be used to good cause for cooperation and humanitarian responses during and after conflicts. Of course, I shouldn't forget here that universities also, and that's obvious, have the ability through their scholars and through their expertise to offer analysis, context, and assessments. But I should say here again, I think in times of war, conflict analysis is really becoming extremely difficult. The amount of disinformation and not deliberate disinformation, but also something simply getting things wrong is very, very high, of course. And again, a sense of humility is important here, but still, expertise is now really needed. Sound expertise, comprehensive expertise about the region, the conflict, but also possibilities of conflict resolution, because at times of war, the knee-jerk response, activism trap, so to say, where policymakers simply make decisions because they need to be seen to make decisions, is quite high. And good advice and proper advice, and I think making yourself heard if you have deep insights into conflict resolutions is quite important. And again, I stress what I said at the beginning, I do fear a little bit now a sense of a shift again in the entire community of security scholars that should really include both war studies scholars and peace studies scholars, but also experts of diplomacy, that we seem to see a parallel shift to the focus right now on hard power, sanctions and military, and maybe less so on, okay, what do we need to do long-term wise in terms of, or let's put it this way, what has peace studies still to offer in a situation as we're facing right now? But also throughout history, and also that was shown in, for example, the Balkan Wars, there is also in Middle East conflicts, there is also a very strong role that individual conflict and peace scholars played themselves in terms of becoming mediators, in terms of offering track 3 diplomacy, where governments really couldn't officially be seen to meet, academics and universities can. So there's also a certain level in the peace building process of independence and positive impact that universities and individual scholars with mediation expertise really can play, and that shouldn't be dismissed either. Finally, universities are resourceful not only because of its staff, but also because of its students. I've been really impressed with the amount of fundraising initiatives and bottom-up initiatives students have been doing in the last 2 weeks, but also a year ago when it came to the conflict in Afghanistan, but also the Syrian conflict earlier. And I think that's also an important side point to make here. You all have read emerging news, of course, for example, about charges of Western bias and even racism. I think there was some terrible examples in news reporting and media reporting about comparing this conflict on European soil now to other conflicts in Africa, Middle East, and so on. And while these examples of reporting are indeed terrible and exhibit an Orientalism and a Eurocentrism that, again, comments that were incredible, we should also take very much the situation right now with the terrible war on Ukraine as a reminder in our responses, though, that it should be a reminder of all conflicts, ongoing right now. If you're a conflict scholar, you know that at any given time since the end of the Cold War, there are between 30 and 40 conflicts in any given year around the globe. And again, it's important indeed to maintain awareness of what can be done in different regions and different conflicts for us as universities, so not to become passive or helpless bystanders, but also to play, even if it's a small role, a role. And I think that also has become really important right now with all the attention on Ukraine and all the deserved and important attention now on Ukraine, to not forget the other conflicts indeed. And you might also have examples where staff organized spontaneously, fundraising wise, but also collecting material, goods, and even in a night and 24-hour journey drove to the border of Ukraine themselves and so on. I've seen and been impressed quite by some of those ad hoc bottom-up examples as well. But when everything is said and done about these issues, far more can be and needs to be done. So I think the first step for us, our first obligation, is to be aware of what is already going on. Where can we use synergies? Where can we put with not even massive resources already a big magnifying effect? And I think just a couple of things to point out. For example, the Corimba Group of European universities, which is an umbrella network, has already put out a very good resource on their website on what their different member universities are already doing. So you can already see there how maybe universities can link up and reinforce each other's actions there, but also get inspirations. We also should maybe be far more ambitious than we would normally dare to be. So I say this with all, again, awareness of the constraints that we face as university managers. I see a current petition, for example, in my own university that was started by an associate professor and an early career tutor, of saying, look, it's not enough to have just a couple of scholarships. We really need to set up now a university and excel ourselves for students or scholars fleeing conflict. So there's a petition for 1,000 students and scholars to be hosted from war-torn regions. Of course, this cannot only be done by one university, but a university can push it and try to lobby the Ministry of Education as much as other universities to join here. I did already mention, of course, about making sure that this is really now geared, because of the urgency and sense of complete atrocity in Ukraine, but also to widen this once this initiative is getting the relative support and momentum for, of course, people fleeing from other conflicts around the globe as well. It's a good time now to support and expand already existing initiatives. I mentioned the new schools, new university consortium in exile. If you go to the website, you can actually, if you're a university leader yourself, or you can ask your university leaders to make a pledge to join that consortium, because then as a network, it's pretty effective. You will then have to dedicate concrete places for hosting scholars or students. And this is rapidly expanding. So moving from US universities only now also to universities in Canada, the UK, Germany. I've also, I think, even 5 universities from Germany have joined, Middle East, Africa, and so on. It could also be the time now to really think about, and maybe this is something for the European University of Wellbeing Association in itself, linking up with other European university alliances to establish a dedicated university in exile network for students and staff fleeing from Ukraine, but also for, and I really stress this, for Russians who are increasingly against the war, speak out, and of course face terrible repression and persecution here as well. Just 2 days ago, there was news about Moscow University, where 15 students protested against the war. They were all excluded from their studies. I think there's also something that we need to focus on and keep our eye on. And that's also something we have to strongly lobby with our own umbrella science organizations and ministries, that some kind of focus here on Russian society is quite important, because this is a crucial moment here as well. If we lose the support of progressive elements and anti-war elements in Russia, we lose a huge chance also in the long term. The universities are really multipliers. We can maintain a continuous awareness raising, but also fundraising momentum for core humanitarian activities in Ukraine. This is particularly for UN efforts, but also for a variety of civil societies active in Ukraine. This also means supporting independent journalists that are still acting and reporting objectively in a sea of disinformation and, of course, now war propaganda from all sides. It also means small crowdfunding initiatives that can be coordinated, and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned before, we should, of course, not forget what is the core business of universities, our specialist knowledge-driven policy advocacy. And advocacy, I mean here really at every level of government, local government when it comes to refugee reception, national governments when it comes to policy, security policies, and European approaches here as well. And that also includes looking in the long term, really further investment in the research, education, and societal initiatives in all matters spanning security, peace, global affairs, and societal well-being. And I don't say this out of my own interest, but I say this really also having seen and watched a decline in funding on social science and humanities research that, alongside natural sciences, really needs bolstering, particularly when we see now across Europe major readiness to commit financial resources to other aspects of government. This is where I think time-wise I need to pause. I think there are lots of value now in really giving you the time to share your thoughts, maybe also point out the initiatives that you are already involved in, or certain ideas that you could have on this topic. I thank you already for your attention, again for your time, and I'm really looking forward to your responses.
Thank you, Joachim, for your insights and for the lecture. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think our participants have as well. I mentioned that you're all invited to use the Q&A function to ask your question, and I'll pick them up. And I know that takes usually a moment or two. You know, maybe you're still kind of processing all the information. So I was thinking to open up the discussion with a couple of points while you type in your questions or reflections. So also with your permission, Joachim, I was thinking to throw in one or two questions for the debate, and then I'll shut up and then let the participants plug in. But I was thinking as you were speaking about this current crisis that there's this saying, never waste a good crisis, and the previous one that has not actually ended yet, the global health crisis, has had a quite transformative role for universities in sense of digital revolution and digitalization. And I was wondering if you think that we can learn something from that and try to use that in helping universities in Ukraine and Russia. You see that as something possible bottom up? Do you think that it's a bit far-fetched? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I'm always a bit cautious about the sentence, never misuse with crisis. Yeah, because of course, so I think the first important point again is that the crisis of the war and the suffering right now is atrocious and difficult to really comprehend. And that, doing something about it directly now in any way, I think should be our first priority. But I understand the sense of what you're saying in terms of the transformative effect that, for example, the pandemic had. I mean, yes, these effects are always that, and I speak now from management again, our default position of finding 10 reasons of why certain changes cannot be done, and it will be too costly, or will be too uncomfortable, or will be too controversial, or it will face a lot of opposition from a variety of bodies or red tape, that these things all of a sudden can be done very, very quickly. If the sense of urgency is there. And of course, yes, the digital transformation is one example, the ability to learn everywhere, the reflection also on what's the right balance between attending institutionalized offices for work versus doing it in your own pace and in your own place, can be to some extent be transferred to the crisis right now. I think both in academic terms, research on security and peace, but also societal awareness. Of course, the immediate threat of war to this extent, and I refer here also to maybe that this was a false sense of security, and those of us as citizens who have seen the suffering in Syria, who've seen the suffering in a variety of conflicts in Africa, Myanmar, who've seen and have been active in trying to do a little bit to reduce the suffering there, know, of course, that war is around us, has been around us all the time. But of course, now, for a variety of reasons, it has become somehow much closer. It has become much more threatening for ordinary citizens in Europe and their own livelihood. And I think that requires, of course, and has already created a huge shift in terms of thinking about security, thinking about defense, whether that's for the better or worse in the long run. That's a question to be very vigorously and actively debated, I think. For example, we've seen a potentially far-reaching shift in Germany, I should say. I mean, this was a speech by a chancellor, not yet a law or anything far from it, but he committed 100 billion euros extra as his extra fund to beefing up German defense. Something that was resisted for 40 years and unthinkable. So you see, of course, far-reaching shifts here. But I think anything that distracts from all concentration by policymakers, by advocacy, communities, by the international organizations, where we see so much damage right now. I mean, I haven't even touched on what this means for the United Nations system, what this means for the international order. When a permanent five, when a key actor that is supposed to uphold the international body of law, norms, and protection that was set up after the Second World War is the actual aggressor. I've not even touched on that. I think this is what the immediate attention needs to be. But I also hope an increased awareness that these things require sustained attention, and sustained attention can only be ensured through education. So that also means that I think that's something, hopefully, that will come out of that. But as I said, it's probably of secondary importance right now.
Thank you. And I see there's a question from Mira, so I'll just read it out in case not everyone can see it. So Mira says, thanks for the lecture. I would like to use this possibility for sharing a webpage from Leiden University where all information about Ukraine can be found. So I hope that this is visible to everyone. Otherwise, I'll post it in the chat as well. Some of the cited examples, Mira goes on to say, are here, but also more information for students or staff who need help. So not really a question, but more sharing information. Thank you, Mira. This is very helpful indeed. I hope everyone can see the link. Otherwise, we'll put it in the chat.
I think you have to copy and paste it because I can't see it. Really, you have to post it in the chat to everyone. Yeah.
All right, then it's in the chat now. You can hopefully see it now. Thank you, Mia. Thank you. All right. Any other comments or thoughts or questions? Please feel free to write them here. I will see them and I'll read them out loud. In the meanwhile, if I may, I have another kind of follow-up question. It's a bit contentious, perhaps, but I'm starting from a very neutral position. Very, just curiosity. So we talked a lot about what we can do more for universities in the Ukraine, and also in the Ukraine, but also in Russia. But I was thinking, looking at a European university, European higher education landscape, how do you think this will affect and change the landscape, be it the content of the topics that are being taught, being and the research consortium and partnerships that are being drawn up? We talked about science diplomacy. There's a situation now that, it's very difficult to engage with partners from Ukraine or Russia. And how do you think this affects, the teaching landscape, but also the research?
Yeah, I mean, let me say that I was so last week I was very concerned what's happening in the Netherlands, for example. I mean, luckily this has been corrected, but I the initial response last week by the Dutch ministry, for example, was that any kind of contact, for example, with Russian scholars or Russian students or panels or presentations should really be stopped as part of the same logic of sanctions. I think there was some reactions to that, and that was then pretty quickly changed so that universities can decide on a case-by-case way of what the engagement is supposed to be. Of course, it's a delicate thing. It's very difficult. Many universities are completely state in Russia are, of course, completely state controlled. This is not only since now, but during the last 20 years, really. I mean, there's been a lot of I don't want to say purges, academic purges essentially have taken place. So you have to be very, very careful in terms of cooperation there. But that doesn't mean, again, the individuals that colleagues have across Europe need to be reached out to. So my point is here, I think when I refer to knee-jerk reactions, I think it's really important that we don't fall into that. We need to maintain and remind ourselves, again, without overplaying it. I also have issues with overestimating our importance, self-importance, and so on and so forth. I think humility is, we are in the third row, but my question is, what can we do in the third row here of within our own powers, without unnecessarily belittling ourselves? But I think the idea of the importance of academic diplomacy has been underestimated, and that's something important. I hope that, and I'm sure, because that this will have an impact also on thinking in the European Commission and on the European higher education area, because they are, if we look at the examples of COVID, for example, very reactive and reflective on ongoing challenges, and it will take some time, but probably less than we think. It will have an effect on funding schemes. It will probably lead to additional dedicated priority areas, which then has a trickle-on effect for institutions, of course, in terms of offering either education formats or specific research streams with societal impact on the question of war and peace, on the question of conflict, European security. And I also think it probably, coming back to your earlier question, right? I mean, what could be the positives of things that normally don't advance so fast? I do hope it leads to a common European security and defense approach. So something that is defensive, but that is, effective through really multilateral pooling. I mean, it's understandable that every national government in Europe now is racing towards beefing up their militaries, but I think it would again be a pointless exercise if that's not done in the European context. And again, security studies wise, I think there's going to be quite a lot of research. But again, I also see the complaints of colleagues from peace studies that are saying, let's not throw out increased capacities of conflict prevention, mediation, diplomacy, even if it seems to be right now not the time, or it seems to be a failure of diplomacy right now. I mean, the amount of marginalization, I think, of emphasis on mediation and conflict prevention, both in practice and theory, has been a bit astonishing during the last years, and that's maybe also an opportunity to refocus focus on that. And then finally, I think much will happen simply through students. I've been impressed in recent years really by Generation Z, as often referred to, and their by and large value-driven, actionism-driven attitude, much different than when I was a student, really, especially in the field of international affairs, global affairs, security studies. It used to be often only 10 years ago, very easy to teach a class by just showing them the challenges and waking them up and showing, look, this is all the problems we're facing. And that was your lecture. And now that's considered a precursor, because you will have a student within 10 minutes saying, well, that's great, but what are the answers? So what's the solutions? What can we do? And if you stand there and go, well, the solutions are complex, then your students will tell you that then maybe your subject is irrelevant if you can't give us proper concrete answers. So I think the action-oriented, value-based mindsets of students will, I think, also lead to demanding simply that universities and that we find some answers collectively with students, I think.
Indeed, thank you. I was just thinking while you were speaking right now, how we went from all the three major topics that you cover in your research, and how you show how they're intertwined, actually, security studies with higher education and teaching excellence. The actual teaching. So I think that's very, very important and interesting to follow. So yeah, bottom up and top down approaches, I think, needs to be undertaken at the same time. If I think we have another couple of minutes that we could devote if there are other comments from the audience. In the meanwhile, I was thinking and I was reflecting that we live in the true interesting time, and there's a famous Chinese proverb that says, "May you not live in interesting time," but there's maybe something that we can learn from it. And this lecture today has served to that purpose. As well. So I'd like to thank you all for joining. And of course, I'd like to thank our speaker for taking the time and presenting this very interesting topic to us today. As you know, this lecture, it's not a one-off, but it's part of a lecture series that will continue. And I'm just going to take the opportunity to announce that the next one will take place on the 24th of March. And it will be on cultural heritage, well-being, and the future. You can check it on the EUniWell website, where you can find also the other lectures part of this series. So if there are no other comments, I'd like to thank you all again for joining. I wish you a good afternoon and a good rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.